The moment the bulldozer bucket touched my roof, every person on that HOA board thought they had already won. I remember the smell first. Fresh diesel hanging in the morning air, mixing with the dry, dusty scent of splintered wood and sun-baked shingles. It drifted down the quiet cul-de-sac like something that didn't belong in a peaceful American neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches and every mailbox matched the same approved shade of black. I had just turned onto Redwood Ridge Drive after a 14-hour flight and a 2-hour drive from the airport when I saw the cloud of pale construction dust floating above my property. At first I thought maybe a contractor was repairing a fence or resurfacing the driveway. But then I saw the excavator. 40,000 pounds of bright yellow steel sitting right where my front porch used to be. The crunch of gravel under my tires sounded louder than usual as I slowed my truck to a stop across the street. A handful of neighbors stood on the sidewalk with coffee mugs in their hands, watching like spectators at some strange suburban event. And right in the middle of my front yard stood Linda Whitmore, president of the Redwood Ridge Homeowners Association, holding a clipboard against her pressed white blazer like she was supervising a landscaping project instead of the destruction of someone's home. The hydraulic arm lifted again with a slow mechanical hum, sunlight flashing off the metal bucket before it pressed gently against the roofline of the house my father built 32 years ago. The wood gave way with a dull cracking sound that echoed down the quiet street. Linda didn't flinch. She simply checked something on her clipboard and nodded toward the operator like this was just another line item on her morning schedule. When she noticed my truck parked at the curb, she turned slowly, that perfectly rehearsed HOA smile already forming on her face. I stepped out of the driver's seat and the warm Texas air hit my face along with the fine powder of construction dust drifting across the yard. The house looked smaller than I remembered, half the roof already gone, sunlight pouring straight through the open frame where my living room used to be. Linda walked toward me across the grass with confident little steps, her heels barely leaving marks on the neatly trimmed lawn. "Mr. Carter," she said calmly, like we were meeting at a neighborhood barbecue instead of beside a demolition site. "You should have paid your HOA dues." Her voice carried the polite tone people use when they believe the matter is already settled. I looked past her shoulder at the excavator idling quietly beside what used to be my garage. The engine gave off a low, steady rumble, the kind of sound that vibrates through your boots when you stand close enough. A breeze moved through the cul-de-sac, carrying the faint smell of fresh sawdust and warm motor oil. Everyone around us seemed perfectly certain they were witnessing the end of a simple HOA dispute. What none of them realized yet was that the property they had just torn down didn't belong to some careless homeowner who forgot to pay a few association fees. It belonged to a federal investigator who had spent the last 8 years dismantling financial fraud operations across 3 states. And the small metal badge resting quietly inside my wallet was about to turn their tidy little neighborhood meeting into something very different. I stood there for a moment listening to the excavator idle like a patient animal waiting for the next command, the low vibration humming through the ground beneath my boots while dust drifted lazily across the yard that used to hold my father's front porch swing. My name is Daniel Carter, and until that morning the small ranch house on Redwood Ridge Drive had been the only place in Texas that ever truly felt like home. My father built it himself in 1991 when this part of the county was still open pasture and oak trees instead of carefully regulated cul-de-sacs with matching fences and perfectly symmetrical flower beds. I grew up learning how to repair fence posts in the August heat, how to change oil in an old pickup truck, and how to fix whatever broke instead of throwing it away. The wood frame that the excavator had just pushed aside was the same wall where my father once hung a faded American flag every 4th of July. After he passed away 6 years ago, the house became the one thing I refused to sell, no matter how many offers came in from developers who wanted to turn the land into more identical suburban homes. I travel, often for work, sometimes weeks at a time, which meant the house sat quiet more often than not. The grass still got cut, the property taxes were always paid, and the lights on the front porch turned on automatically every evening at sunset, just like they always had. Most of the neighbors assumed I was some kind of consultant or engineer who worked out of state. That assumption suited me just fine because the truth usually made people uncomfortable. For the last 8 years I have worked as an investigator with a federal financial crimes task force, the kind of job that requires long hours, quiet observation, and a habit of letting other people talk themselves into trouble. My work has taken me from dusty county courthouses in Oklahoma to corporate boardrooms in Chicago, following paper trails that most people would never even notice. Fraud, illegal liens, hidden bank transfers, property scams disguised as legitimate business. It is amazing what people will attempt when they believe nobody is paying attention. When the Redwood Ridge Homeowners Association first appeared 3 years ago after a developer bought the empty land behind my property, I treated it the same way I treat most complicated systems. I watched. I listened. I kept records. Linda Whitmore had taken over the presidency almost immediately after the subdivision opened, and within 6 months the neighborhood began operating under a long list of rules about paint colors, lawn height, fence materials, and something called community compliance assessments that seemed to grow longer every quarter. I paid the standard annual dues without complaint because arguing with a homeowners association board usually wastes more time than it saves. But standing there that morning, staring at the broken roof beams scattered across the dirt where my living room used to be, I realized something important. This was no longer a misunderstanding about paperwork or overdue notices. This was a deliberate decision made by people who believed they understood the law better than the people it was written to protect. And that kind of confidence has a very predictable ending. I watched Linda Whitmore for a moment before answering her, because people reveal more about themselves when they believe they are in control. The excavator engine idled behind her with a steady mechanical hum, while the operator sat patiently inside the cab waiting for another signal. A faint metallic clink echoed as the bucket settled against the pile of broken roof beams that used to protect my living room from the Texas summer sun. Linda adjusted the papers on her clipboard with the calm confidence of someone who believed every step of this morning had already been approved and documented. She had the kind of posture that comes from years of running neighborhood meetings and issuing violation notices, shoulders straight, chin lifted slightly, eyes scanning the scene like a manager reviewing a finished project. If you have ever attended a homeowners association meeting in the United States, you know the type of person I am describing. The one who memorizes the rulebook, quotes it line by line, and believes that a laminated badge from a community board carries the same authority as an actual law. Linda Whitmore had built a reputation in Redwood Ridge for exactly that kind of authority. When the subdivision first opened, she introduced herself to every homeowner with a handshake and a folder full of printed guidelines. Grass height standards, approved exterior paint colors, mailbox design regulations, trash can placement rules, even seasonal decoration schedules. Within a year, most of the residents treated her instructions like official municipal policy instead of suggestions from a neighborhood committee. I had seen people repaint entire houses because Linda claimed the shade of beige on their siding was half a tone outside the approved palette. I once watched a delivery driver stand confused at the entrance gate while Linda explained the difference between permitted commercial vehicles and unauthorized contractor trucks. She spoke with the same confident rhythm every time, the careful tone of someone who had repeated the same explanation hundreds of times until nobody bothered questioning it anymore. The Homeowners Association board supported her completely. 3 other members stood near the curb that morning watching the demolition with identical expressions of polite satisfaction, each one holding a paper coffee cup like they were attending a weekend neighborhood cleanup event instead of witnessing a legal decision that would reshape someone's property forever. The man in the blue polo shirt was Greg Hollister, the treasurer, a retired insurance adjuster who believed spreadsheets could solve every problem. Next to him stood Patricia Langford, the secretary, who handled violation letters with the efficiency of someone who once worked in a county records office. The last board member was a quiet real estate broker named Mark Dempsey, who mostly nodded during meetings and repeated whatever Linda had already decided. Together they formed the small committee that governed Redwood Ridge. They believed they were protecting property values and maintaining community standards. And judging by the comfortable smiles on their faces that morning, they also believed they had just resolved another routine compliance issue. What none of them seemed to notice was the way I continued studying the scattered remains of my house instead of arguing. Years of investigative work had trained me to recognize patterns in situations exactly like this one. People who feel powerful tend to rush toward the finish line without checking the paperwork behind them. And standing there beside the broken foundation of my father's house, I had a growing feeling that the paperwork behind this decision was about to become very important. I did not answer Linda right away because silence has a way of making people talk longer than they planned. The excavator engine continued its low, steady rumble behind her while dust drifted slowly across the yard like pale smoke in the warm Texas sunlight. Somewhere down the street, a lawn sprinkler clicked on and began spraying water in a slow arc across a perfectly trimmed lawn, the quiet suburban rhythm of the neighborhood continuing as if nothing unusual was happening. Linda glanced down at the papers on her clipboard and then back at me with the calm expression of someone explaining a parking ticket. "We sent multiple notices," she said. 3 certified letters, 2 violation warnings, and a final compliance notice regarding unpaid association dues. Her voice carried clearly across the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk. I could hear the faint rustle of their clothes and the quiet murmur of curiosity as they waited to see how the conversation would unfold. Linda turned the clipboard toward me and tapped one of the documents with the tip of her pen. "Your account shows $8,400 in unpaid assessments and penalties," she continued in that same steady tone. "According to the bylaws of Redwood Ridge Estates, failure to resolve the balance allows the association to place a lien on the property and pursue corrective action." The phrase corrective action hung in the air like it was a perfectly normal solution. Behind her, the excavator operator leaned slightly out of the cab window watching the discussion with mild interest. The steel bucket rested quietly against a pile of broken shingles that had once been part of my roof. Greg Hollister took a sip of coffee and nodded in agreement, while Patricia Langford adjusted her sunglasses and scanned the scene like a clerk reviewing paperwork. Mark Dempsey stood with his hands in his pockets, studying the empty space where my front door used to be. Linda flipped to another page and held it up so the group could see the printed heading across the top. "Notice of abandonment and structural noncompliance," she read aloud. "Issued 30 days after failure to respond to multiple association communications." Her pen tapped the paper again with a soft plastic click. "When the property owner does not respond, the association is authorized to initiate remediation procedures to maintain neighborhood standards." I let my eyes drift slowly across the street, taking in the row of identical houses with their tidy driveways and symmetrical landscaping. The same place where I used to ride my bicycle as a kid when the road was still gravel instead of asphalt. The air smelled faintly of hot engine oil and dry cedar wood from the broken beams scattered across the yard. Linda followed my gaze and gave a small polite shrug. "We tried to reach you," she said. "But from our perspective, the house had been sitting empty for months. The board voted unanimously to proceed." She gestured toward the excavator behind her like it was simply another piece of maintenance equipment. "Demolition is part of the remediation process when a structure falls out of compliance." For a moment, nobody spoke. The neighbors watched quietly, waiting for the argument they clearly expected to happen next. But instead of raising my voice or stepping closer to the machine, I simply looked back at the clipboard in Linda's hands and asked the one question that matters in situations like this. Who approved the demolition permit? For the first time since I stepped out of my truck, Linda Whitmore hesitated. It was not dramatic, just a small pause, the kind that lasts less than a second but changes the rhythm of a conversation. Her pen stopped tapping the clipboard. The excavator engine continued its quiet rumble behind her while the afternoon sun reflected off the windshield of a parked sedan across the street. Linda blinked once and adjusted the stack of documents in her hands like she was reorganizing her thoughts. "The board authorized the action," she said finally, her voice still steady but a little more careful now. "All demolition procedures were carried out according to association policy." I nodded slowly and looked past her at the broken frame of my house. A beam that used to support the living room ceiling leaned against a pile of shingles like a fallen ladder. The scent of dry cedar wood drifted through the warm air along with the faint smell of diesel fuel from the idling machine. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and then went silent again. I took a few steps forward across the dirt where my front walkway used to be, the gravel crunching under my boots. The neighbors shifted slightly along the curb, watching the movement like an audience waiting for the next line in a play. Greg Hollister cleared his throat quietly, and Patricia Langford folded her arms as if preparing for an argument. But I did not raise my voice. Instead, I studied the papers in Linda's hands with the same calm attention I use when reviewing a financial ledger. Association policy does not issue demolition permits, I said. City building departments do. Linda straightened her shoulders and gave a polite smile that looked practiced enough to survive 100 neighborhood disputes. The structure was classified as abandoned and non-compliant, she replied. Under our bylaws, the board can initiate corrective measures to preserve property standards. She lifted the clipboard slightly, as if the weight of the documents proved her point. I let the silence stretch again for a moment, listening to the steady idle of the excavator engine and the faint ticking sound of cooling metal from the bucket resting against the debris. The operator inside the cab leaned back in his seat, clearly unsure whether he should keep waiting or shut the machine down. Corrective measures, I repeated quietly. The words sounded strangely clinical compared to the empty space where my house had stood only hours earlier. I reached down and brushed a thin layer of dust off a small piece of wood lying near my feet. The grain pattern looked familiar. It might have been part of the doorframe my father installed the year I left for college. I set the piece gently back onto the ground and looked up at Linda again. So the board voted to place a lien, declared the house abandoned, hired a demolition crew, and removed the structure, I said. Linda nodded with the confidence of someone listing routine maintenance tasks. That is correct. The neighbors watched closely now, their earlier curiosity turning into something quieter and more cautious. Even the breeze moving through the cul-de-sac seemed to slow as if the street itself was listening. I slipped my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket and felt the familiar shape of the leather wallet resting there. Years of investigative work had taught me that moments like this usually arrive without warning, the exact second when someone realizes the situation they thought they controlled has another side they never considered. Linda Whitmore was still smiling politely when I finally opened the wallet. I opened the wallet slowly because there is no reason to rush a moment that will change the direction of a conversation. The leather creaked softly as it folded back in my hand, the familiar worn texture pressing against my fingers the same way it had during hundreds of quiet interviews, court filings, and long nights spent reviewing financial records under fluorescent office lights. For a second, nobody said anything. The excavator engine continued its steady idle behind Linda, sending a low vibration through the ground that traveled up through the soles of my boots. Dust drifted lazily through the warm Texas air, catching the sunlight like fine powder suspended above the broken outline of my father's house. I slid the badge out just enough for the metal to catch the light. It was not large, not dramatic, just a small oval of polished steel mounted on dark leather with the words Federal Financial Crimes Task Force engraved across the center. The effect was immediate. Linda Whitmore stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence she had been about to start. Her clipboard lowered slightly, the confident posture in her shoulders tightening as her eyes focused on the badge. Greg Hollister shifted his weight where he stood near the curb, and the coffee cup in his hand paused halfway to his mouth. Patricia Langford lowered her sunglasses slowly, the motion deliberate, as if she needed to see the badge clearly to confirm what she was looking at. Even Mark Dempsey, who rarely spoke at board meetings according to the neighborhood gossip, leaned forward just a little. I did not raise my voice. I simply held the wallet where Linda could see it, and then closed it again with a quiet snap. My name is Daniel Carter, I said calmly. I work with a federal task force that investigates financial fraud, illegal property claims, and misuse of association funds. The words settled into the still air of the cul-de-sac like a stone dropped into calm water. The neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk exchanged quick glances with each other, their earlier curiosity shifting into something much quieter. The excavator operator inside the cab straightened in his seat and looked down toward the group as if suddenly unsure whether he should still be there at all. Linda blinked twice, the confident rhythm of her earlier speech completely gone now. This is a misunderstanding, she said carefully, adjusting the papers on her clipboard again as if the documents might somehow restore the certainty she had a few minutes earlier. I looked back at the empty space where my living room used to be, and then at the stack of forms in her hands. That depends, I replied evenly. Because from where I am standing it looks like an association board declared a private home abandoned, issued a lien, authorized demolition, and hired contractors without a verified municipal permit. A small breeze moved through the street, carrying the faint scent of warm engine oil and dry wood across the yard. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time since I arrived on Redwood Ridge Drive that afternoon, Linda Whitmore looked less like the woman who controlled the neighborhood and more like someone who had just realized the paperwork behind her decision might not be as complete as she believed. For several seconds, nobody moved. The quiet of the cul-de-sac felt heavier than before, like the air itself had slowed down. Linda Whitmore looked at the closed wallet in my hand, and then back at the empty space where my house had stood only hours earlier. The confident rhythm she carried when I first arrived had disappeared completely. The excavator engine still hummed behind her, but now the sound seemed louder in the silence, the mechanical idle echoing off the nearby houses. Greg Hollister finally lowered his coffee cup and cleared his throat softly. Patricia Langford glanced toward the excavator operator and then back at Linda as if silently asking what they were supposed to do next. Mark Dempsey shifted his weight near the curb and studied the broken foundation in front of us with the careful attention of someone suddenly reconsidering every document he had signed during the last board meeting. I slid the wallet back into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. The glass screen reflected the bright Texas sunlight for a moment before it lit up in my hand. Linda watched the movement closely. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, her voice much quieter now. I tapped a number I knew by memory, the same one I had used many times during investigations that started with paperwork and ended with long conversations inside county offices and bank conference rooms. The call connected after 2 rings. "Daniel Carter," I said calmly. "I need a municipal verification on a demolition authorization issued in Redwood Ridge Estates." I paused, glancing briefly at the scattered remains of my house, before continuing. "Yes. Structure removal completed this morning." Linda's eyes moved quickly from my phone to the board members behind her. The clipboard in her hands no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked more like a stack of unanswered questions. I listened quietly as the person on the other end of the call spoke. The breeze carried the faint scent of warm engine oil and dry cedar across the yard, while the excavator operator leaned slightly forward inside the cab, watching the conversation unfold through the windshield. "That is what I thought," I said after a moment. "Thank you." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Linda tried to smile again, but the expression did not quite reach her eyes. "If there is some kind of administrative mix-up, we can resolve it through the association office," she said quickly. "The board always cooperates with proper authorities." I nodded slowly and looked down the quiet street where the afternoon sunlight reflected off the rows of identical rooftops. "That is good to hear," I replied, "because the city building department just confirmed something important." Greg Hollister leaned forward slightly. Patricia Langford held her sunglasses in one hand now, her attention fixed on my face. Even the neighbors along the sidewalk seemed to hold their breath waiting for the next sentence. I glanced back toward the excavator and the empty lot that used to be my home. "There is no demolition permit registered for this address," I said calmly. The words settled over the group like a sudden change in temperature. Linda's shoulders stiffened and the clipboard slipped slightly in her hands. The excavator operator looked down at the machine controls as if realizing he might have been working at the wrong job site all along. And for the first time since the board members arrived that morning, the certainty that had carried them through this entire decision was gone. The silence that followed my words lasted just long enough for everyone on that street to understand something had gone very wrong. Linda Whitmore did not answer right away. Her eyes moved quickly between me, the empty lot, and the excavator behind her, as if the entire situation had suddenly shifted under her feet. The late afternoon sun hung low above the rooftops now, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac and turning the dust in the air into a pale golden haze. Somewhere in the distance a car door slammed, and the faint sound echoed through the neighborhood before fading away again. Greg Hollister looked down at the papers in Linda's hands, and then back at the broken foundation where my house had stood for more than 3 decades. "That cannot be right," he said quietly, though it sounded less like confidence and more like hope. Patricia Langford stepped a little closer to Linda and whispered something under her breath, but the words were too soft to carry across the yard. Mark Dempsey had stopped pretending to look comfortable altogether. He stared at the excavator like someone trying to decide whether it had always been a terrible idea to bring it here. Linda cleared her throat and forced a tight smile that looked nothing like the confident expression she wore earlier that afternoon. There must be some kind of delay in the city records, she said, lifting the clipboard again as if the printed pages could restore the authority she had lost. The association followed proper procedure. I let the statement sit in the air for a moment while a slow breeze moved through the trees lining the street. The scent of dry wood and engine oil still drifted across the yard, but now there was something else mixed into it. Uncertainty. I looked down at the broken concrete slab where the front step used to be, and then back at the small group standing across from me. Municipal records do not delay demolition permits, I said evenly. They issue them before any structure comes down. The excavator operator shifted inside the cab again and finally turned the engine key. The machine went silent with a heavy mechanical sigh that echoed through the neighborhood. Without the engine noise, the street felt almost unnaturally quiet. The neighbors watching from the sidewalk began speaking in low voices now, their earlier curiosity replaced by the careful tone people use when they realize something serious is unfolding. Linda looked at Greg Hollister and then back at me again. The association has legal authority to protect community property values, she said, though the words sounded rehearsed instead of certain. I nodded once. Associations enforce neighborhood guidelines, I replied calmly. They do not authorize demolition without city approval. Greg Hollister rubbed his forehead slowly. Patricia Langford stared at the stack of documents in her hand like she was seeing them for the first time. Mark Dempsey finally spoke, his voice quiet and uneasy. Linda, did the contractor ever show you a permit? Linda did not answer right away. Her eyes moved across the empty lot again, following the outline of the house that no longer existed. For the first time since I arrived on Redwood Ridge Drive, the board members looked less like officials managing a neighborhood and more like people who had just discovered the ground beneath their decision was far less stable than they believed. And in situations like that, the next step usually arrives faster than anyone expects. The street stayed quiet for a long moment after Mark Dempsey asked the question, the kind of silence that slowly forces everyone to face the same uncomfortable thought at the same time. Linda Whitmore did not answer him immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty foundation where my house had stood since 1991, the late afternoon sunlight stretching long shadows across the concrete slab and broken lumber scattered around the yard. Without the excavator running, the entire cul-de-sac felt strangely still. You could hear the faint rustle of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of traffic from the highway 2 miles away. Greg Hollister shifted uneasily beside the curb and finally set his coffee cup down on the hood of a nearby car like his hands needed something else to do. Patricia Langford slowly turned the pages on Linda's clipboard, scanning each document with the focused look of someone realizing that every line of text might suddenly matter a great deal more than it had an hour earlier. Mark Dempsey repeated his question quietly, his voice steady but uncertain. Linda, did anyone actually confirm a permit? Linda inhaled slowly and glanced down at the stack of printed notices as if searching for the answer somewhere among them. The confidence she carried when the demolition began that morning had faded into something far more cautious. The contractor said everything was filed, she replied after a moment. The explanation sounded smaller than the situation surrounding it. I watched the board members absorb that sentence one at a time. Greg Hollister rubbed the bridge of his nose. Patricia Langford stopped turning pages altogether. Even the neighbors gathered along the sidewalk seemed to lean slightly closer, listening to every word. A soft breeze moved across the lot again, lifting a thin swirl of dust that drifted over the broken remains of the front porch steps my father poured with his own hands more than 30 years earlier. I studied the empty space quietly before speaking again. City demolition permits are not optional paperwork, I said calmly. They are verified before equipment arrives. Nobody argued with that statement. The absence of the excavator's engine made every small sound more noticeable now, from the quiet creak of a fence down the street to the faint tapping of Patricia Langford's pen against the clipboard. Linda finally looked back at me. For the first time since I arrived, the expression on her face held none of the authority she had carried earlier that day. It looked more like the expression of someone realizing that a decision made with confidence might have consequences she never expected. What happens now? Greg Hollister asked quietly. I took a slow breath and glanced once more at the open sky above the place where my living room used to be. The sunlight reflected off scattered pieces of wood and brick like fragments of a memory spread across the ground. Then I looked back at the group standing in front of me. Now, I said evenly, the city building department will review what happened. Here. No one spoke after that. The board members stood together in the quiet street while the neighbors slowly began drifting back toward their houses, the excitement of the afternoon replaced by something much more thoughtful. I remained where I was for a moment longer, listening to the wind move through the trees and looking at the empty lot that had once been my home. Because in the end, the lesson unfolding on Redwood Ridge Drive had nothing to do with neighborhood rules or unpaid dues. Authority is easy to claim when you believe no one will question it. But real accountability has a way of arriving quietly, often at the exact moment someone realizes the paperwork behind their power was never as strong as they believed.